Mr. Speaker, we're ready to answer all interpellations for the Department of National Defense budget.
Gentleman from Davao, we now proceed with this interpellation.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, distinguished sponsor, the chairman of the Committee on Appropriations. Before I proceed, may I inquire how come it is the chairman who is now defending the Department of National Defense? It is written here in my schedule that the sponsor of the budget of the Department of National Defense is the Honorable Osmeña, the distinguished gentleman from Cebu.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I am the official spare tire for all vice chairs who could not defend it for whatever reason or another, Mr. Speaker.
So is the original sponsor present, Mr. Speaker?
I am not quite sure. I've been very busy the whole day. I have not been able to monitor his presence, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Chair, on the screen is an exact copy of the appropriations and obligations under the National Expenditure Program 2011. Again, I apologize, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. I did my best, but the fonts are really small, so it's in the NEP anyway. The next clip, Mr. Chairman, would highlight the more important or the more salient provisions of the National Expenditure Program as far as D&D is concerned. These are the new general appropriations, the automatic appropriations, the continuing appropriations, budgetary adjustments, total available appropriations, and the unused appropriations. Under appropriations and obligations, the Department of National Defense in its general fund, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, has to, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Speaker, has two sources of funding from RA Republic Act 9524, which was enacted in 2009, and Republic Act 9498 as reenacted, which is the budget for the 2008 fiscal year. Am I correct in saying this, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, can I find out what page is this on our NEP, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, this... And then, Mr. Speaker, to simplify things, I don't want to belabor you more because, you know, all I'm saying, these are just for information purposes. I'd like to inform you that the Secretary is a worshipful sir of mine, and I don't want to belabor him also. In fact, I want to help him. I'm not really here to belabor you, Mr. Distinguished Sponsor, but just for the sake of information.
Yeah.
These are I reviewed the NEP, Mr. Speaker, and I came up with all of this total, as I've said. This was taken from the new general appropriations, etc., the automatic appropriations, and I came up with this, Mr. Speaker. I noticed, Mr. Speaker, that original budget under Republic Act 9524 or the GAA of 2009 By the way, Mr. Speaker, nandun din to sa official gazette ng ng 2009 at saka ng 2008. Nandyan po yan sa summary, no? So, simply put, Mr. Speaker, the original budget of the DND is more or less 56.4 billion, Mr. Speaker, as reflected in the screen, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, under appropriations and obligations, your general fund was given an additional of 13.9 billion pesos under the reenacted budget of Republic Act 9498. May I just, for clarificatory purposes, Mr. Speaker, may I just know, may this representation know, how did this happen, Mr. Speaker? Is the Republic Act 9498 reenacted, is it a continuing budget, Mr. Speaker? Should it be reverted back to the Treasury, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the 13.9 billion, although I'm having, this representation is having problems because the figures differ from what we have for 2809, but for clarification, just to go through the exercise, the 13.9 billion covered for the portion of the year 2009 where the 2009 budget was not yet ready. This was the portion where 208 funds were reenacted, Mr. Speaker.
So in other words, apart from the 56.4 billion, another 13 billion from the 2008 budget was added. Just so that we are clear, Mr. Speaker.
I think 13. Mr. Speaker, actually at the end of the year of 2009, the 13.9 billion, which was the portion reenacted, eventually went up to overall savings. So at the end of the year, the only appropriations that were really obligated was 56.4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's precisely, you've answered my question which I haven't asked yet, which I was supposed to ask, because I was supposed to ask where did the 13.9 billion under RA 9498 went, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for that. At least we are saving time, Mr. Speaker.
I knew you wanted to make this fast for the Secretary of National Defense, Mr. Speaker.
On this slide, Mr. Speaker, we can see under automatic appropriations, if we break it down, we have revenues coming from customs duties and taxes, including those of tax expenditures. We have retirement and life insurance premiums. We have special account amounting to more than 8 billion pesos, Mr. Speaker, and proceeds from sales of military camp around more or less 730 million, Mr. Speaker. For purposes of letting our colleagues know, may the good sponsor and chairman of the Committee on Appropriations explain to this representation what this 8 billion pesos under the special account under the automatic appropriations and of the national expenditure under the NEP, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, is this under the Department of National Defense
Yes,
still?
yes.
but according to DND, they do not have a special account of 8 billion in 2009, Mr. Speaker.
Anyway, Mrs. Speaker, let me go to the next slide. Maybe the next time the finance officers of the DND should total all their official gazettes. It's all in there. Next slide, please. So I'd like to show that there was a continuing appropriations of more or less 5.3, and there was an unobligated release for MOOE under RA 9498 of more or less 3.3, and unobligated release for capital outlay also under RA 9498 amounting to more or less 2 billion, Mr. Speaker. Now, if we go to the next clip, it is noticeable that under RA 9498, the original capital outlay for 2008 was or amounted to 100 million and 340,000, Mr. Speaker. However, in the continuing appropriations report, the unobligated releases, as shown in the clip, Mr. Speaker, for capital outlay rose to as much as 2 billion pesos, Mr. Speaker, and this representation would naturally wonder how the DND or the department was able to generate such a huge amount of money, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I really apologize. The department is having problems with the data because they themselves couldn't believe they have a 50.9 billion allocation. So we're really having problems with the data. It doesn't match the data that we have. Mr.
Well, this representation would be happy to furnish Secretary Gasmin with copies of my numbers. Maybe you ought to check your finance officers, because all of these were taken from previous Gazette and present NEP, Mr. Speaker. If we go to the next clip, because I was made to understand that Dar family is here, and I want to go on with this as fast as I can. If we go on to the next clip, under the budgetary adjustments, Mr. Speaker, nandun to sa ano eh, sa NEP to, Mr. Speaker, di ba, nung sa first slide ko, oo. We have transfers from and transfers to. Now, under transfers from, we have the calamity fund, the contingent fund, the miscellaneous personal benefits fund, the retirement benefits fund, the international commitments fund, the over savings. But what interests me, Mr. Speaker, is the ALGO, the allocations to local government units. Because this is under the transfer from, meaning we take money from the ALGO. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am concerned because can you please cite in any of the official gazettes whether there is or there are specific provision or provisions which allow funds from ALGO to be transferred to the Department of National Defense. Not that I'm against it, because we want DND to have a leeway as far as its budgetary requirements is concerned. But I just want to know what specific provision or provisions allow or allows the transferring of funds from ALGO to the DND.
Mr. Speaker, the 1 billion here under allocations to local government units was used to fund the Kalayaan Barangay program under the DND. Anong provision? But can you transfer from Albu? As a general.
Oh.
Mr. Speaker, as a general rule, in fact, we could even cite the Constitution that any savings of government could be transferred to another agency, Mr. Speaker. In this case, it's DND as the implementing agency.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but it is to my understanding that we are now in the process of deliberations on our budget, and this representation has reviewed the official gazette, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I had it photocopied, and it doesn't say here that there is a particular provision that authorizes the transfer of ALGO funds to the Department of National Defense. Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor.
Tinatanong niya how do you transfer Albu to Kalayang Barangay? Anong authority?
But you know, Mr. Speaker, to go on, because
Where does it say here? It came from Albu. Well, Mr. Speaker, going back to the question, if we look at the official gazette of February 2010, page 953, this is the chapter under allocations to local government units, or ALGU. And the special provision, number 1, is the use and release of funds for the Kalayang Barangay program. This is the basis for the transfer, Mr. Speaker.
all right, Mr. Chairman, I'm in a very I have a clear thought this afternoon, Mr. Chairman. I would accept your answer, Mr. Chairman. Let me just then ask, who identifies, or first, the question is, number 1, ano ba itong
Kalayang Barangay, Mr.
Yes,
Speaker.
Kalayaan Barangay Program. And the second question would be, who identifies and who are the beneficiaries of the same?
Mr. Speaker, if I could go back to the special provision and if I may read, use and release of funds for the Kalayang Barangay program. Funds under the Kalayang Barangay program shall be used to transform conflict-afflicted communities into peace and development areas through accelerated barangay-focused rehabilitation and development. Barangays to be included in the program shall be determined by the President upon recommendation of the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process and the Secretary of the Department of National Defense, Mr. Speaker.
All right. Can we just go on with the clips quickly, please? All right. This just shows the historical review of the SPF, the AFP Retirement Fund, and Program Fund from 2002 to 2011. Next slide, please. No, prior to that. Yes. That is also a historical review of funding from 2002 to 2011 of the OSEC, the Government Arsenal, the NDC, the OCD, the Veteran Affairs, the Armed Forces, which covers the Philippine Army and the Philippine Air Force and Philippine Navy, etc., etc. And so, that ends my slide presentation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Distinguished Sponsor. Made this representation because I am very much concerned with the NDCC, Mr. Chairman, because this representation, whenever we have floods in our province, I join the Provincial Disaster Coordinating Council in helping victims of flood and natural disasters, Mr. Chair. In fact, I lend my pickup truck to the PDCC so that they can use it for emergency purposes. Mr. Chairman, may I just therefore know from the good ladies of the Operation Committee as well as the DND family, how much available funds do we have left for NDCC? Particularly, for example, Mr. Chair, because we are in need of flood control systems, Mr. Chair. For example, Mr. Chair, because we are in need of flood control systems, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Speaker, you're asking for the remaining balance for the year.
For the year, yes.
And actually, Mr. Speaker, the new name is NRDMC.
National
NDRMC.
and
National
NDRMMC, National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council.
NDRRMC is the new
NDRR.
National Disaster Risk.
What is the
National Disaster Risk Reduction
Management Council?
Council, Mr. Speaker.
And who chairs the NDRRMC, Mr. Speaker?
The Secretary of National Defense chairs that agency.
I'm very happy to hear that. And who is the vice chair? Am I correct in saying that the vice chair is the chief of the OCD?
Mr. Speaker, we have 4 vice chairs, and they're the National Council members. Well, the 4 vice chairs are the Secretary of Department of Social Welfare and Development, the SDILG, the
You mean the
DOST, and NEDA, Mr. Speaker.
So the secretaries of DSWD, local government, DOTC, and DOTC. Am I correct?
DOST.
DOST,
Mr.
I'm
Speaker.
sorry.
And NEDA, Mr. Speaker.
And NEDA, okay. So, I'm asking this, Mr. Chair, because we want to naturally prevent another disaster like Ondoy, Mr. Speaker, on a national level, and severe floodings on a more parochial level like the ones that happens in my province, Mr. Speaker. In cases of natural disasters, Mr. Speaker, to whom should various local governments or even civic groups run to for help and assistance, Mr. Speaker? And how are funds being made available? Are they made available automatically, or do we need a declaration of calamity for funds to be released, Mr. Speaker?
Calamity declaration, state of calamity declaration, for the release of these funds. Well, we would turn to the Office of Civil Defense. That would be the point of contact. Does it require calamity, state of calamity?
Before you can release funds. Before you can release funds.
So these 4 vice chair are under the OCD, and the OCD reports to the NDRRMC chairman. Am I correct? Am I correct about the hierarchy of?
No, Mr. Speaker. The 4 vice chairs a while ago, they work under the chair, who is the SND. The OCD is the secretariat of the council, Mr. Speaker.
I see. So let me make this clear. From the NDCC chairman, NDRRMC chairman, and the
Areas were afflicted by disaster. Again, I reiterate, there's a need for a state of a calamity to be declared. Likewise, there are regional offices to be nearer to the calamity site, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, this is my last parochial concern as far as NDRRMC is concerned. The provincial government has already furnished through the Secretary our problems, and I think the OCD is well aware of that, is right behind you, and I hope you do something about it, because this representation myself helps in the rescue efforts whenever very bad floods happen in our province, Mr. Speaker. I am tempted to discuss the budget of the OSEC, but I just let it go away to give way later on to probably DAR. But let me just ask few questions, because this is relevant, I think, not only for Davao del Sur but nationwide. Because, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Distinguished Sponsor, this happened last elections, Mr. Speaker. I am well aware that the good sponsor is a academician, is a graduate of the Philippine Military Academy. Is it normal practice for a battalion commander, for example, the 39th Infantry Battalion, to take sides, Mr. Speaker, in a political exercise, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first to correct, I am not a graduate of the Philippine Military Academy. I was a plebe from the Philippine Military Academy. I graduated from the United States Naval Academy.
Oh.
But going back to the question,
Forgive me for
just-
the unintentional...
no, it is just to correct the records more than anything else.
all right.
But it is not within the training of the military, nor is it in the indoctrination of military to have battalion commanders participate in political and partisan activities. In fact, the Constitution allows the military to partake in election activities by merely voting. That is all, Mr. Speaker.
Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this may be true in theory or sometimes in practice, but there are instances, Mr. Speaker, that these things actually happen. In fact, Mr. Speaker, last elections, two of the companions of my cousin, a mayor of a Malalag town, municipality in Davao del Sur, were shot and killed by personnel of the 39th Infantry Battalion, headed by then Colonel Lyndon Paniesa, Mr. Speaker. I am terribly saddened because I do not want to demean the armed forces, Mr. Speaker. Mahirap po may paglaban sa Abu Sayyaf, sa MILF, sa mga NPA. Maliit po ang sweldo ng ating kasundaluhan. However, there are officers within the armed forces that give the armed forces a very, very bad and bad name, Mr. Speaker. Yes. Mr. Speaker, is it normal practice for a battalion commander, Mr. Speaker, to go with politicians and go on vacation in Boracay, Mr. Speaker?
It is not normal practice, Mr. Speaker. I just conferred with the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. If the good gentleman from Davao could write this down, specify all the names, specify all the incidents from the highest ranking officer to the lowest enlisted personnel, they will conduct the proper investigation, Mr. Speaker.
Is it normal further that after an officer of the armed forces go to Boracay, then he goes with politicians and go to Plantation Bay in Cebu City, Mr. Speaker?
Not normal, Mr. Speaker.
Then this representation would suggest, in fact, strongly suggest, that there are plenty of very worshipful brothers in the armed forces as well as in the staff. Please extend your cable tow and have this checked, because I do not want this kind of officers in the armed forces to ruin the service and the dedication and the good name that our men in uniform had through the years built and defended not only the department but the Constitution as well as the Republic of the Philippines, Mr. Speaker. Because I'm doing this, Mr. Speaker, because this former battalion commander of the 39th IB should not get away with murder, Mr. Speaker. There is a great conspiracy here, which would lead me later on to my interpellations in the DOJ, Mr. Speaker. Because I'll give you an example. I'm about to wind up. The Provincial Director of the Philippine National Police, Colonel De La Rosa, conducted a raid, a legitimate raid, Mr. Speaker, together with search warrants in the house of the barangay chairman of Pinalpalan. Mr. Speaker, several high-powered firearms were found. They found M16s, M14s, M16s with M203s. They even found a brand new, I don't know what to call that, but it's like a tabor, a machine gun with a magazine below it, and it's brand new. And so, the director of the Philippine National Police was as part of doing his job, filed the case before the prosecutor's office. Unfortunately, in Davao del Sur, there is what we call conspiracy. Money talks. As far as corrupt policemen is concerned, corrupt regional directors of the PNP is concerned, and corrupt officers, especially battalion commanders of the infantry battalion, of the Army, of the Philippine Army. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope, DND and AFP comes here to us now and asks for budget. I have no problems with that. We want to modernize the AFP. We want to help the DND. We want to empower the Disaster Management Council, because they will be the first responders in cases of emergency or conflict in areas. But let me just re-stress that it is proper, Mr. Speaker, distinguished sponsor, that they cleanse their ranks and make sure that the armed forces does not participate in any political exercise and remain to be loyal and loyal not only to our flag but above all to our Constitution, Mr. Speaker. With that, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Distinguished Sponsor, I thank you for your very patient with me, and I thank the DND and the AFP family. Again, to the DND Secretary, I hope you will extend your cable tow to this lonely representation from Davao del Sur. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Well,
Thank
Majority
you from
Leader.
the good gentleman from Davao del Sur.